I don't know if anyone remembers a couple years ago now, when the pandemic first started, there was a meme going around on Facebook and Instagram, an image of the social distanced baptism, right? It was a joke of somebody holding up the baby as somebody else had a water gun, a super soaker, and from 6 feet away was spraying them. Right? Then the Jewish circles, I don't know if anyone actually made a meme, but the joke was, right, what would the social distance bris look like, right? And people joked about the tree trimmers and things of the sort. I thought that this meme in all the different rabbinic Facebook groups I'm a part of would probably be the most I ever heard about baptisms as a rabbi, or talked about baptisms as a rabbi. But if anyone's been following the news this week, baptisms have been a topic of conversation, and in rabbinic circles in particular online, people have been asking the question about this case that recently happened in Arizona, of what the Jewish equivalent of it might be. So the case was in Arizona, there was a priest that it turned out had for decades been doing baptisms incorrectly. He'd been saying, "we baptize you," as opposed to the correct form, "I baptize you." And in doing so, the church was very clear that all of the baptisms he had performed are invalid. So for people with whom this ritual has significant meaning and importance, that's a big thing to do. To say that their baptism didn't really happen. It was as if they were never baptized. For some people, it's something reversible. They can go and get baptized. For others who passed away unbaptized, it creates serious theological questions and issues. But this isn't the first time this has happened. There are other cases. Another priest from Detroit a few years ago learned that his own baptism that he had had as a child was done incorrectly with the we, and was therefore not valid. The next part of that story is that it meant he wasn't actually a real priest. You have to be baptized to be confirmed, and you have to be confirmed to be ordained as a priest. So since he wasn't actually baptized, he wasn't a priest. Interestingly, you don't have to be a priest to do baptism, so the baptisms he performed, though he didn't have a real baptism himself, were correct. But he had to go ahead and get reconfirmed, and all of the confirmations that he had done, those were declared invalid. All of the confessions he had heard, it was as if nobody had confessed to him. These are just two of these cases, and there are more that are out there. So I'm not here to talk today so much about the Catholic Church, although I have opinions, clearly. But what is the Jewish equivalent was the question that rabbis and lay leaders and Jews were asking in these Jewish Facebook groups that I probably spend too much time on. What is the Jewish equivalent? And they suggested things like perhaps it's an incorrectly filled out ketubah or a get, right? A get is probably the closest example. Because someone who has a bar mitzvah and reads a word incorrectly, they're still a bar bat mitzvah. Somebody who has a ketubah that's incorrect, they're still married regardless of the ketubah. They just have to get a correct ketubah, but they're still married. A get raises some serious issues, but there's also rabbinic courts and ways of dealing with that when those issues come up, right, to avoid the issue of mamzerut. So the answer is that I don't think there really is a Jewish equivalent, because in Judaism, in our tradition, there's this concept of lechatchila and bediavad. Lechatchila means from the outset, and bediavad means after the fact. So there's the lechatchila ideal, the goal, the way something should be performed, the way you should set out to do something. In the baptism case, say, I. And bediavad, after the fact, if a mistake was made, but the intentions were good, there's a lesser form. It's not the perfect way of doing it, but it's okay. It doesn't invalidate the whole mitzvah, the whole act in the Jewish tradition. And it's an important concept. It comes up thousands of times in the halachic literature. It's not a one-off idea. In our Parsha this week, we read about the mitzvah of kashrut. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. It's where the rabbis get all of the laws about milk and meat and kashrut, and it's pretty straightforward, right? Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. There's not a lot of wiggle room. The rabbis say you can't eat milk and meat together, you can't cook them together, you have to wait between them, you have to have separate dishes, utensils. There's not a lot of wiggle room. And yet, you're cooking your chicken soup and you accidentally grab a milk spoon to stir it. The soup's not treif. Lehadchila, you should have grabbed a meat spoon, a fleishik spoon to stir meat soup, fleishik soup. But as long as it was a small amount compared to the total volume of the soup, b'diavad, it's okay. The soup's still kosher. Accidentally spill a little milk into that soup. Keyword here being accident, right? Accident. B'diavad, it's still kosher. Lehadchila wouldn't have any milk in it. But b'diavad, it's okay. After the fact, it wasn't your intention to do so. But the concept gets more interesting. Let's say I'm making a brisket for Friday night dinner and a nice dairy salmon for Shabbat lunch, and I bake my side dish alongside the brisket. Saturday comes around and I realize I don't really have a lot of sides to serve, but I still have some leftovers of that great kugel I cooked with my brisket the night before. Lehadchila, you shouldn't eat something that was cooked alongside meat in an oven with a dairy dish. But b'diavad, there's not other food to eat, it's okay. It's still parv. You can have it with your dairy lunch. Now that's more interesting because it wasn't an accident. You intentionally cooked it with the meat. You just didn't at the time intend that you would have it with dairy. It was a decision later. But you can still make that decision. There's a set time for prayers. Lehadchila, you should say the Shema from sunrise until the end of the first quarter of daylight. But the rabbis say, let's say you're going on a trip, you're traveling, you have to leave before that time, and you're not going to be able to stop along the way to say the Shema due to circumstances that are beyond your control. So you can say the Shema beforehand, before the time that you're supposed to say the Shema. Lehadchila, you would wait till sunrise, but b'diavad, it's okay to say it earlier. If beyond your control, you won't be able to. Now, what does beyond your control really mean? Because the law isn't, don't take your trip. The law lets you take your trip. It lets you live your life and say the Shema earlier. So notice what b'diavad has shifted to here. The translation so often used of these concepts as before the fact, or from the outset and after the fact, they're not really so accurate. It's not like the case where you accidentally used the wrong spoon, or the case where you cooked your parv dish with the meat and weren't thinking about when you might want to eat it with a dairy dish. You're going on a trip. You've planned the trip. You've made the decision that if I go on this trip, you know you're not going to be able to say Shema. So b'diavad, after the fact, before you've done the trip, before it's happened, you do it earlier. What can that mean? After the fact, before you leave. So it's not really after the fact. I had a teacher in rabbinical school who would refer to it as lehadchila is the ideal, and b'diavad is what's real. It's the reality. It's lived life. There is an ideal, don't stir your meat soup with a dairy spoon, but then there's real life. There's the fact that we've all had those days where we're tired, our minds are focused on other things, our to-do list is too long, we're rushing around. There are things that are stressing us out, problems at work. Maybe it's a sick child, maybe you're taking care of an elderly parent or a friend, or you're just having one of those days and you forget. B'diavad is real life. Life is rarely perfect, and inevitably, there are times we don't live up to that ideal. You're leaving on a trip, you won't be able to say Shema at the ideal time. The tradition doesn't ask you not to live your life. It recognizes that this is real life, and it gives you another option. So the question then is, what do I really want to talk about this morning? And it's that more people are abandoning religion faster than ever. In COVID, in times of crisis, people didn't turn back to faith. For many, many people, they were pushed further away from it. And it's not just Judaism I'm talking about. People are leaving all faiths at increasingly more rapid rates. A study published a couple months ago by the Pew Research Center found that a quarter of Americans identify as none when asked what their religion is. No religious affiliation. Christianity lost more than 10% of its market share over the last decade, while the unaffiliated, the nones, grew almost double. And it's reasons, I think, like that recent news story about baptisms. I'm not Catholic. It's not my place to say where the line should be drawn for the church. But for many people, many practicing Catholics I've spoken to, it just didn't make sense to them. How can one word change something that's so important and so significant in their lives? That loved ones who have passed away weren't baptized. That the confessions they said weren't real confessions. The issue for many people is that religion doesn't speak to the real world that they live in. It speaks to an ideal world, a perfect world, a life in a vacuum. But for most of us, that's not our life. If we look at our Parsha, there's another interesting example of Bediavad and Lehatchila. The rabbis tell us that our Parsha about the golden calf actually comes before the story of the building of the tabernacle. Lehatchila, the ideal for God, was that there would be no set way to worship. There wouldn't be the strict structure and rules and everything that went into the temple service and the sacrificial service. The Israelites would just worship God. But then when they were left with that freedom to do anything that they wanted, what did they do? They built and erected an idol. And it's because of that, God then commanded the building of the tabernacle. They needed rules and limits. They needed guidance in how to worship. Lehatchila, we would have just worshipped freely. But Bediavad, we need a protocol, laws and limits to help guide us so we can focus and direct that worship in the correct way. But there's an important lesson in that. The rules, the structures, those aren't the goal. They were a means to an end, and the end being to worship God, to see divinity and holiness and sanctity in the world. We have another lesson in our Parsha. When Moses comes down from the mountain with the tablets, what does he do? He smashes them. And the rabbis offer one reason, one of the reasons the rabbis offer for why he smashed them is what's the second commandment, or the first, depending on how you count it. You shall have no other gods. Do not make an idol. Lo ta'aseh lecha fesel. Do not build an idol. And so Moses comes down the mountain and sees the Israelites have broken this rule. And what does he do? He smashes them. When the people can't live up to the rule, Moses, he showed leadership. That's what the rabbis tell us. Right? He's Moshe Rabbeinu. He's the paradigm example of what rabbinic leadership should be. When the people can't live up to the rules, he didn't let God judge them too harshly. He didn't let God demand the penalty, which for idolatry is a pretty steep one if you read our books. A pretty steep one. Instead, he smashes the law. Because the law is not what matters. It's the thing behind it. It's not the structure. It's that connection to the God, to divinity. And today we live in a world where we've made an idol out of the law, out of the lehatchila. That this is the way things should be done, this is the ideal, and it's the only way things should be done. And I'm not talking just here. I'm talking about synagogues and institutions, rabbis and Jewish leaders. I'm talking about in the Jewish world, where we've only taught lehatchila. We've forgotten about bediavad. And that's, I think, the solution to some of our problems. To offer a Judaism, not just for Jews, but religion in general. I think we need to start offering faiths that live in the real world, a bediavad faith. One that offers services and classes, programs and values that speak to the real lives of the people we're trying to serve. Not a world separated from reality. There are communities that do that. There are Jewish communities that stick to a strict lehatchila approach to everything, and they're thriving because people who want that have that place. And if that's what other institutions and places want, then that's the place to go to find that. But if that's not, if it's about reaching the rest of the Jewish world, the people that don't live in a house with 2 ovens and 2 refrigerators, right? The people who don't cancel a trip because the time to say the Shema would be thrown off. If that's the people we're trying to reach, if those are our children and our grandchildren, then we need to create a space and a tradition and use the tools that our ancestors, that the rabbis have passed down to us of bediavad. That's the Judaism that speaks to people's real life experience. And the good news is I think we can do something to stop that flow, to stop that revolving door of people leaving faith, if only faith would start offering beliefs that people can actually use in their lives. Shabbat Shalom.